Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Greetings and peace, loved ones. I pray you're in a blessed state. You are tuned in to Path and Present podcast, and this is Baraka Blue. Alhamdulillah, this podcast is with Dr. Mohammed Rustom, who is a friend of mine and a scholar. He is someone who is a specialist in the mystical, philosophical Sufism tradition. He's written about Mullah Sadra, he's written about Ibn al-Arabi and his school, he's written about Maulana Rumi and the Mazhab-i Ishq, the school of love. And he's currently, for the last few years, he's been doing research and writing actually 2 books on Ayn al-Qudat Hamadani, who is a predecessor of Rumi and Ibn Arabi in the school of love, who was a direct student of Ahmad Ghazali, the brother of Abu Hamid Ghazali. And Ayn al-Qudat is a figure who was hugely influential, especially in the Persianate world, but there's very little that's been written about him in English. So those works should be really revolutionary in the field, and we talk about Ayn al-Qudat in this podcast. Just wanted to give a few updates. So we have, for Rumi Center for Spirituality and the Arts, we have a couple workshops coming up. Starting November 3rd, we have a Rabi al-Awwal workshop. It's called Drawing Near to the Beloved, Poetry and Praise of the Prophet. And this is essentially like a month-long online Mawlid, where we study the tradition of praise, poetry of the Prophet. You have scholars and poets and musicians all talking about this tradition. We talk about the Sahaba, we talk about Imam Busiri, we talk about how this spread to different regions and the centrality of praising the beloved, peace be upon him, in general, and in poetry in particular, and its role throughout Islamic civilization. So we did it last year, and it was the inaugural year, and it was really powerful, and we're going to do it this year as well. So you can register on rumicenterworkshops.com, and we are happy to have you. Whether you're a writer or not, anyone who loves the beloved, peace be upon him, it's a really powerful way to hopefully draw near and increase in love and to commemorate the month of the Prophet's birth. And then directly after that, starting for the month of December, I think December 1st through 31st, we have a course about Rumi, and it is entitled The Ocean Within a Drop, the Poetry and Philosophy of Maulana Rumi. And this is a new course that we just developed and recorded in Konya, in Rumi's hometown, and I really think that it's going to be something powerful. Rumi is beloved in the East and the West, but as he's become popular, as is very common with things as they become popular, often the depth is lacking, right? Things can become superficial. And I think Rumi is one that everyone knows him. He's beloved, best-selling author, but yet there's so much of him that is left to explore. So I really designed the course for those that want to understand his teachings, understand the symbolism, reflect on the main themes he uses, the main symbols he uses. What does he mean when he talks about the wine? What does he mean when he talks about the beloved? What does he mean when he says, sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment? What does he mean when he talks about the partial intellect versus the universal intellect? And also, how accurate are these popular translations? So we look at, the literal translations versus some of the popular versions and things like that. So that is also up on rumicenterworkshops.com, and you could sign up for those. So join us for the Rabi al-Awwal course in November, and join us for the Rumi course in December, and we're happy to have you. That's all I think I wanted to say by way of announcements. As always, we want to thank our supporters on Patreon. They are the reason that you are listening to this. They make this possible. While it is a labor of love, there's a lot that goes into a podcast, and the Patreon supporters make it possible. Patreon is a site that allows you to support Path and Present with a monthly amount and of your choosing. Could be $1 a month, can be 5, 10, or anything that is within your means. And our page there is patreon.com/path-and-present. So please do visit that and support if you find this beneficial. And then feel free to share this with everyone who you think might like it. All right, y'all. One love. Assalamu alaikum. Ayn al-Qudat is someone who most people never heard of.
Yeah, that's right.
But yet he's a really influential and profound thinker, and I've learned about him. I heard about him before, but I didn't really know anything until I started talking to you.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into Ayn al-Qudat. This is an introduction to Ayn al-Qudat.
Yeah, sure.
So just by way of introduction, how would you introduce him to someone who had never met him?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the ways I have found myself trying to just smooth readers and listeners into his world is to say, well, you've heard of Rumi and you've heard of Attar and you've heard of these greats and Ibn Arabi. Well, what was happening 100 and 150 years before they came? They didn't just kind of drop out of nowhere, although in some sense they did drop out of nowhere from the unseen. That is true. But they're also working and living in a certain milieu, especially the Persianate authors. And the immediate backdrop for that is about 100 years of activity, which we call the Mazhab-e-Ishq, 70 to 100 years. And that's associated with the names of Ahmad al-Ghazali, the brother of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and then other authors in that tradition, the most, in my opinion, the most important, being Ayn al-Qudat, who was the student of Ahmad al-Ghazali. So Ayn al-Qudat belongs to the generation that was just before, the activity of authors that we know quite a bit about. He died at the age of 34, so he was very young when he died. And one time, a great scholar of Persian literature once said to me, had Ayn al-Qudat lived longer, there would have been nothing left for anyone else to do. And with every kind of exaggeration, there's a certain element of truth in that. And I'm coming to discover that more and more. So he was the student of Ahmad al-Ghazali, as I mentioned, and he was an avid follower of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali too, whom he didn't meet, but he used to read his books. And in that context, where he grew up, 12th century Hamadan, he'd be reading. He was reading books in rational theology. He fell into a period of intellectual crisis in his early 20s, and Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's books rescued him, he says, from just getting too caught up in this dualistic kind of rationalistic thinking, and it really hurt him. And he was a genius for sure. He had already at the age of 20 written some very sophisticated books. His most important Arabic book he wrote in 3 days, and it had a very long life in the Muslim world. Even Ibn Arabi cites it, so we know that it went from east to west, and it was cited even into the 19th and 20th century. And so on the intellectual level, everyone, he's kind of more associated with this philosophical genius that he had. And he also was, in addition to that, a profound visionary. So that's where I think his greatest contribution comes in. It's when he takes that intellectual training that he has, and he was a legal judge too, so he has all of this knowledge of Islamic law and things like this, and he tries to give you an explanation of the way things are from the perspective not just of a realized intellectual, but most of his writing is taking place from the perspective of God. So, and he makes that very clear in his writings that you're following Islam. He says don't think that's Islam. He says that's Islam majazi. It's metaphorical Islam. There's something else. There's another from God's perspective, the Islam that he sees, the unity and oneness that come from him, that's what I'm after. So once we've understood where this man stands in this tradition, you see that he's doing many things that are unique, at least in writing. He is the first author in the tradition to write extensively about the Nur Muhammadi. The tradition precedes him, of course, going back to Sahl al-Tustari and others. But Ayn al-Qudat is the first person to really take it to its logical conclusions and write about it explicitly in a way that was just, it's never done before, and in the Persian language. So not really conventional. He's crafting a new language. He has a very unique way of speaking. His style of communication is very unique. He also is the author in the tradition following Hallaj, whom he loved a lot, and Ahmad al-Ghazali too, who sees the fallen nature of the devil as a very positive symbol. And he writes the most extensively about that, Tawhid of Iblis. Yes. And the last thing about Ayn al-Qudat, which people are usually not aware of, is that he was a social commentator on in his own context, Seljuk government, and he was somebody who had a problem with corruption at the level of government. That's what put him. He got killed. Omid Safi has shown, not for any ideas of his, but because he criticized the government, and he was a very influential judge. So what we have almost over 160 letters of his, 159 letters or so, that have survived in 3 big volumes of him corresponding with his students, not only imparting spiritual advice, but also speaking about his times, criticizing rulers for stealing money from the poor. His big thing was charity for the poor. He was very big on that. So you get this really rounded picture of this man who, the writings that have come down to us, they happen over an 11 or 12 year period, and he seems to cover almost everything, and he does it in a way that's very unique. So by way of an introduction to him, what I would say is, if you want like a who's who of the 12th century, I think this man, he embodies all of these different styles and modes, and then gives his own perspective on things as really a foremost sage and seer in the Islamic tradition.
Yeah, there's so many places to go. So, I mean, yes. I think it's interesting you say that, and yet there's been so much interest historically in the West with Rumi, some with Hafiz, Saadi, a few of the Persian poets, understandably, and with some of the metaphysicians like Ibn al-Arabi, a few others, but mainly Ibn al-Arabi. Why do you think Ayn al-Qudat has been more neglected?
Yeah, that's a great question. The main reason for it, it's a textual reason. So his books were not available in critical editions, nice Persian Arabic editions, until the 1950s, when one scholar, Afif Husayran, a Lebanese scholar, spent years editing them and putting them into nice editions. So after that period, then people started recognizing him. Otherwise, if an author remains in manuscript form, no one's going to know about him. So Rumi, Hafiz, many of these other authors were very fortunate in that their writings were translated into German in the 1700s, 1800s, and then through many different traditions in American literature, transcendentalist movement and other things. In India, there were also a lot of interest amongst the British colonial officers in their writings. They read German usually, and they read English, and they were good Persianists too. So their own tradition, the reception of Rumi and all of these authors today comes from a certain Western appreciation of these authors for several hundred years. Whereas Ayn al-Qudat's relatively new, 1954, breaks out into the scene, and a lot of Iranian scholars have written about him. But I think one of the reasons why we don't know much about him, is because he's one of those authors who's so forbidding in so many ways that it's kind of like Ibn Arabi, because some of the earliest scholarship in Ibn Arabi, like Afifi, wrote this book in English, and after writing a whole big book on Ibn Arabi and spending years writing about him, he said, I still don't really think I've understood what Ibn Arabi is thinking about. Ayn al-Qudat is like that. It takes a very long time to read him and to situate him. He's the author. I've never seen an author, for example, who cites more Quran on any page than Ayn al-Qudat. In fact, he weaves the Quran so much into his prose that you think to yourself, it's as if he lives literally in the Quran. Like Shaykh al-Alawi says, that Dhunnun al-Misri, that the Quran has mixed with our flesh and our blood. And Shaykh al-Alawi has a poem, Imtazaja bidammina wa lahmina. وَالْعُرُقِ وَمَا فِينَا. It's completely just everything. Our sinews, our bones, our blood, it's all Quran.
You pointed out two, topics of his thought that are particularly unique in Islamic history, and that is the Nur Muhammadiyah, and then the second one is the Iblisology. So let's talk about the Nur Muhammadiyah first. What does that mean by way of introduction for those that aren't familiar with that concept, and then how does Ayn al-Qudat, what does he say about it? How does he work through that?
Yeah, well, the long and the short of it is that we can call his view, we call him, which is a name that comes in the tradition, he doesn't use that word himself, he's called a Muhammad Parast, a real adorer of the Prophet, almost a worshipper, even somebody who really, reveres him at a level that it's you just feel ashamed when you read him, how short one falls in their love for the Prophet. And what he says is, he starts with several basic, he comes to this problem from many angles. He says, just wait, stop, and just think about what has happened here. He goes, God picked a person to hold his word in himself. So he says, how can God, who's pure light, transmit himself to anything other than pure light? If he was dark or some kind of tenebrous human state, even a little bit, it cannot contain that light. So he goes, that means this is pure light that's receiving the Quran. And then he starts giving verses from the Quran to demonstrate why the Prophet is light. Right? It says, it speaks about following God and the nur that has come, that he has sent down. Quran says, what do you think that nur is? And he says, don't think it's arms and skin and feet. That's not nur. Nur is something else. So in the Islamic tradition, there's a very firm doctrine, and it has been developed to great extent by the likes of Ibn Arabi and many others. The first thing that God created was the light of the Prophet, which is to say, that's the first instance in which God turns his face to the created order. The first entity that emerges from that in the mirror of creation, which God sees himself in, it's the light of the Prophet. And so Ayn al-Qudat says, if that is the light that has been revealed, and it came to us in a human form, then we owe it to ourselves to follow that light, and then to use the guidance that comes from that light to go back to the source of all lights, God, Nur al-Anwar. He calls him also Nur al-Wujud, the light of being. But now that introduces many questions. One of the things that comes up in Ayn al-Qudat's way of thinking is, given that the Prophet has this light and he corresponds to the function of God's guidance in the world, what can we say about the darkness that's in the world? The obvious fact that there are things other than light in the world. And he says, well, that makes perfect sense, because whenever there's light, there's going to be a shadow, as there is right now in his room. Whenever there's light, there's going to be a shadow. And he says that shadow that is cast by that light, he says you refer to him as the devil. You refer to him as Iblis. He's nothing other than the shadow of that light. And by doing this, he doesn't posit Iblis as somehow a source of evil. The Islamic tradition doesn't see Iblis as a source of evil anyway. The word shadow is never used as for Iblis as evil. He's the nafs is evil in the Quran, but not either. Iblis is just a trickster who, like one of my teachers said, like the rest of us, he has his problems. And but he has a function. He has a very important role to play in the cosmic economy of things. And Ayn al-Qudat, seeing that Iblis has this role in the grand scheme of things, seeks on one level, like many of the authors before him, to exonerate him from the blame that was thrown at him. So he says, in one passage, he says, if you knew the story of Iblis, it would become extremely dear to you. And it turns out that the story of Iblis is nothing other than your story and my story. And he makes that very clear. He says, this man who was cast out of paradise for a little while, he's seeking, like the rest of us, to go back. He's an image of us who loves God. And he says, actually, Iblis is much better than us, because we love God, yes, Iblis loves God so much that he's even willing to take the blame from God and kind of be the fall guy, metaphysically speaking, for all of this existence to emerge. So there's one beautiful passage where he says, Iblis's sin was that he loved God. And Muhammad ﷺ, his sin was that God loved him. And by virtue of that quote-unquote sin, God's love for him, the Prophet, it's his responsibility to bear the mercy of God to the world. So the Prophet's function in the world is to spread the mercy. Iblis has another function, because in order for mercy to exist, in order for guidance to exist, in this realm of shadows and lights, you need to have the opposite.
Right,
So
yeah.
you need the misguidance.
Right, yeah. Rumi has a line talking about, a king who has a kingdom, a great king, right? He has gifts and robes of honor.
Yeah.
And he also has the guillotine.
Yes,
and
that's right.
The prison cell.
Yeah.
But it's all for the same reason.
Exactly.
It is.
Exactly.
It is
He's
out
not
of
a
love
king.
for the kingdom.
That's right. That's
it's
right.
Out of love for
it's
the.
beautiful.
And I think you told me before. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this really stuck with me. A line of Ayn al-Qudat, something to the effect of talking about Iblis, and of course, the foundational Quranic story of Iblis is, he was a jinn who was a great worshiper.
Yeah.
Great worshiper of God. Constantly in service to God, and then, Allah creates Adam and commands the angelic beings to prostrate, and they do, illa Iblis, except Iblis.
Yes.
And there was something, if I remember correctly, you told me that Ayn al-Qudat puts it that outwardly Allah said,
That's
bow.
right. That's right.
But inwardly,
That's right. Exactly.
He whispered
It's
to
beautiful.
Ayn al-Qudat, don't bow.
Exactly. This is precisely what he says. Exactly. You have a very good memory, because that would have been a couple of years ago. Yes, he says to him. He says the outward command was, he says to him, do this, right? But behind that command there is the divine will, which is to tell him, don't do it. And so Ayn al-Qudat says, he goes, what was he supposed to do? He was just fulfilling his command. So he takes the whole Tawhid of Iblis motif to a whole new level, because he's not just a fallen lover, right? But he's somebody who's compelled by God, by his love for him and his love for him, to do the things that he should do. Now, Ayn al-Qudat, given his philosophical background, he has this explanation that human beings are compelled into freedom. And he's following Ibn Sina in this regard. Al-insan mutarrun fi al-ikhtiyar. Human beings are compelled to act freely. It resolves many problems intellectually, right? Because you're thrown, you're compelled to act. And Ayn al-Qudat says that, well, that's how we're morally responsible, right? We're morally responsible because God has thrown us into the realm of freedom, and he's saying, do, act. And he says, but that same imagery also applies to Iblis. Don't think he's somehow out of that compulsion. The only difference was that he was compelled to act according to his nature. Our nature is freedom. It's like fire. He says, fire just must burn. That's what it does. Our nature is to choose. He goes, Iblis's nature is to love. And a lover essentially cannot disobey the beloved, because that his nature is just to love. So he's a perfect model for us. He says only the Prophet is above Iblis in terms of the model because God's eye is on him.
Wow.
Right? Now, one of the things that he says, and this really, this just shows the deep ingenuity of his thinking. He says, in one passage where, he rethinks and reframes the rights of Islam on every level, explaining what prayer really is, what fasting really is. And he gets into these amazing discussions, and he says, you think that zakat is something that we have to pay? Yes, we have to pay it if you meet certain requirements in Islamic law. The zakat is mandatory for those who are earning income. He goes, but every wealth that is earned is zakat-able, right? The alms tax has to be paid. He goes, what's the greatest wealth? God says, I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known. So God himself, being that hidden treasure, made himself known. And Qudat says there's a big zakat on that one. And that zakat that has to be paid, that alms tax, is mercy. And who's going to distribute that mercy? The Prophet. the Prophet ﷺ. He is the distributor of the mercy, which is why he's in the Quran, Rahmatun lil Alameen, mercy to the worlds. But in doing the distribution of the mercy, he needs a little bit of assistance. And again, Iblis comes up there, right? He's going to come up, he's going to show people, your job is to also, offset. His job is to offset the guidance. Because then when you have guidance and misguidance coming together, that's when you can actually have choice and guidance.
Sure.
So he's kind of a necessary clog in this whole...
things can become manifest, because if there's no scarcity, no one can ever be generous. They can never manifest it,
right?
Because if you're
beautiful,
or if there's no danger, no one can manifest bravery.
Exactly, right?
So
right.
Has to
precisely,
be,
exactly.
Has to be these things.
Exactly.
So what would? Because I can already feel, certain.
Yeah.
What's up? Oh, it's fine. I can already feel. Certain Muslims, not only Muslims, Christians and other people of faith, cringing.
Yes, of course, at the whole.
At a reframing of the devil in positive light. So what would Ayn al-Qudat? What do you think? How would he respond?
He would. He doesn't. I mean, he takes it to such a level. When you read him, sometimes you think to yourself, "Oh my God, this is insane." Like at one point, a few times, I was thinking, should I even put this in the book? Like, because I have to be honest, I have to put it and explain it. So, in one passage, he says he's reporting a discussion that's taking place between two of his masters, and the master says, the devil's doing his job. Should we send salawat on him? Or should we say La'natullah alayh? Should we say God bless him and grant him peace? Or should we say La'natullah alayh, God curse him? And they're debating this. Ayn al-Qudat's reporting this, and then the Shaykh says, no, you should still say God curse him. And then Ayn al-Qudat comes in, he says, yes, because his khordan, his ghaza, his food is curses. Wow. He wants that. So Ayn al-Qudat would say, if you're affirming the badness of the devil, like in, let's say, Catholic theology, where it's like, uber badness, right? The devil is, right? Or in any normal Islamic theological framework, right? The devil is not a source of, guidance through misguidance. There's no discussion like that. There's just dalal and that's it. He says, but you're allowed to say that. In fact, you should say that. Don't mistake the relationship of the devil to you and to God and to the Prophet. Just see him for what he is. Right? And this is the advice. If he was here today, he would say, you have to see him for what he is. You can hate him. You can say he's going to go to hell or whatever you want to say about him. But you, like every lover, should be able to see the good in everything. And surely there is something positive that you can say about the devil. If he was pure evil, he wouldn't exist. Right? The pure privation is non-existence. There must be something good about him. Now, one image that he gives to take it home in a more concrete way, he plays on many different images. One image that he has is the imagery of the face, the beautiful face. And this kind of, points up the necessity of the devil in this cosmic economy of things. He says, if you look at a beautiful face, so think of Persians, they love beautiful, round face. And he says, this white face that you can love, it needs an index. Otherwise, how are you going to see it? If it's so beautiful. So it needs a mole. Now that mole, all of a sudden, it's a symbol of beauty in Persian poetry in many cultures, but also it takes you to the face. It's the index, right? It's there. And he goes, that mole is like the light of that's the Prophet. That the Prophet corresponds to the mole. He has many different ways of speaking about it. This is the most standard way. And why? Because when you've seen the mole, you've seen the face. You go to the mole, it takes you to the face. But what's a beautiful face without some hair? Right? So these beautiful black locks, jad,
frame the face.
Exactly, frames the face, shows it to you, shows you its beauty, but hides the face too. And he says, in order for that beautiful face to be there, you need the mole and you need the hair. And this is exactly, so he's saying, if you love beauty, you'll be able to put all things in their proper place. And if you love God, then you'll be able to look past any and all things insofar as they can take you to him. Once you're there, Iblis is not necessarily a problem for you. But if you see things as Ayn al-Qudat, as from God's perspective, then Iblis, as he says, he's a dear friend and an intimate. He calls him the leader of leaders. So he's the leader of the fallen one. That's what he said. The leader of the fallen ones. He is the guide of all of those who've fallen in the eyes of God, and we all fall in the eyes of God. Who's perfect? We all fall.
Yeah, and I mean, it's clear too that like Iblis is a perfect servant of God. Like he has a role.
Yeah.
That's necessary for creation.
Yeah.
Right? He's playing his role right and exact.
Yeah, exactly.
And
he's done nothing wrong.
It's so fascinating,
yes,
but
yes.
it is. He's essentially saying that, and was it Ayn al-Qudat who points out that I've heard there's some scholars that mention that like because Iblis was such a muwahid that he affirmed divine unity, that even though there was outwardly a command to prostrate, he refused to prostrate to other than God.
Yeah, exactly.
Because think about it, we can't prostrate.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
We can't prostrate to other than God. That's not permissible for a believer. Yeah. So he was saying like, I would rather endure being the outcast and the accursed than prostrate to other than God.
He says in one poem, he says, you threw me into the ocean, or this is Attar, I think, where he says, you threw me in the ocean, tied my hands behind my back and said, try to save yourself and swim. Right? Or another one, he said, you douse all this oil on me and you say to me, or you throw, I jump in the ocean with my hands tied behind my back and you say to me, be careful, don't get wet. Right? So he's like, I'm doing my job. And it's out of also in the Islamic tradition, if you remember during the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the Prophet asks Sayyidina Ali, he says to him, show me my name so I can cross it out. And Sayyidina Ali says no. He actually disobeyed the Prophet. But that's called ta'adduban, right? It's out of adab and love and respect that you're not going to disobey the Prophet. You're not going to obey the Prophet because you don't want to, he says, I'm not going to cross your name out. And that's pretty much what Iblis is doing here. It's a very similar. He's like, no, I'm not going to take away your right and bow to this clay creation of yours. I'm gonna, and if it earns me wrath, he says, people, no one wants to take the assault on their neck. I'll gladly take it. Give it to me. I will do it for everybody. And Iblis actually, he emerges in Ayn al-Qudat's writings as not only a fallen lover, but a real model of selflessness. He's totally selfless. Even if it means distance from God, he goes, it doesn't matter. I will do it. If everyone else goes to heaven and I don't, that's fine. I've done my job and I know I've always been true to my beloved. So that's Ayn al-Qudat for you in a nutshell. He really takes these things.
I don't know if he says this, but it kind of crossed my mind too that like, the idea too, like I will lead astray. Basically, like to have a jealous, like such a love of God, that, like anyone who truly loves you will not be led astray by me. Yes. So I'm going to help you sort out who's who. Like
precisely.
Right.
Actually, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Yeah, he has a number of passages where he says Iblis is there, so to speak, to separate the men from the boys, and he actually uses a beautiful image of the moth and the moth and the thorns on a rose bed. So he says that the parvana, the nightingale, the nightingale and the rose bed. He says that every nightingale is a claimer of the lover of the rose, right? But when you go to the rose, there's thorns, and so these nightingales, they jump into the thorns, into the rose, but when they notice the thorns, they fly away. And then he goes, but only the true lover will actually jump right in, knowing that they're gonna die, and they'll take it. And so Ayn al-Qudat, that's his image of love. When it comes to Iblis, he says Iblis is a watchman. He's a watchman for those false claimants who are trying to get to God's court. And he's there to stop them and says to them, no, if you're not a true lover, you're gonna stop right here. Only true lovers can go past that door. And he actually has all these beautiful images where, and his function is ihwa, misguidance. Right. For
to
that
distinguish
reason.
what guidance is, and it's like he's saying, I love God so much that I will be the most distant, the most accursed, the most despised. Everyone in creation will hate me, but I am going to do my job impeccably and not care about what anybody says about me, and I will show who's the real lover and who's not, who's really,
Yes, exactly. Dostoevsky in The Brothers Karamazov has this beautiful section where the devil kind of gives like a soliloquy almost, and it comes actually very close to what Ayn al-Qudat says. And basically, this devil, the devil's saying, he goes, what I really want to do, I just want to be reincarnated in the body of a 250-pound butcher's wife, so I can light candles and pray to God. That's all I want. He says, I've been thrown into this mess for reasons I don't know why. And he goes, but I think I know why. It's because every journal needs a criticism column. And he goes, so my job is to, be, again, the fall guy, right? And if that's what I have to do, fine. But that's but what I would much rather do is to, do what all of you guys are doing, praying and worshiping God freely.
Yeah, and that's that kind of the true lover. Yes. Even if the beloved casts them out or pushes them away or slams the door in their face, they will never be deterred at all from their love because
it's not about what they want. It's not about what they want. And remember, so it's not about what they want. It's about what God wants, right? That's why Hallaj says, "Akhtaru Allah, akhtaru," right? Ma takhtaru akhtaru. I want not to want. I want what you want, because what God wants is the best possible want, not what we want. But we have to also remember, for those who hate Iblis so much, one thing that we can all agree on is that at minimum, he's better than an atheist. He believes in God. He's a believer, right? He may not be the best believer.
He's following the commandment too.
He's following the commandment. He's actually, like, that's what really struck me.
Fulfilling his role.
It's amazing because in the Quran, when he's cast out of paradise, there's no questioning. That's the thing that really, before I encountered Ayn al-Qudat as a graduate student, when I used to read the Quran, I thought to myself, that's kind of interesting, because he doesn't ever say to God, why did you do this? God says to him, you're going to be cast out now. And he says, Rabbi anzirni ila yawm yub'athun. He just says, okay, then put me off until the day that they're all raised up. He doesn't even try to defend himself. There's no self-defense. He's just like, all right, bring it on.
Does Ayn al-Qudat mention his response about Adam ana khayran minhu in response, I'm better than him?
Yeah, surprisingly, or maybe not, perhaps not surprisingly, Ayn al-Qudat doesn't draw on that from what I can recall, not even once. That verse doesn't even show up one time. Whereas in later authors, Attar, Rumi, Muhammad Iqbal, even, they're going to draw on that's the diabolical, evil, analogically reasoning side of Iblis, right? I'm better than him. And so...
Yeah, I'm curious, and I think you were the one that told me that Rumi disliked that reading of Iblis.
Yes,
right?
yeah, precisely. So Rumi has a beautiful tale in the Masnavi. It's about Muawiyah, the Khalifa Muawiyah, the fourth Caliph of Islam, where he's known characteristically in the tradition for hilm, shrewdness. No one could pull a fast one on him. So Rumi picks him on purpose, right? And Muawiyah is the Caliph, and the time for the Fajr prayer comes, and as the Caliph, he must go to the masjid and lead the prayer, or be there for the prayer. And so he's remiss in waking up, and so all of a sudden there's some person that enters into his house, and Rumi frames it beautifully. It's coming in the corner, and there's this kind of hiding. It's you really get this beautiful image of this kind of sheepish person, and he says to him, "Look, sneaky." He says to him, "It's the time to pray." And then he starts giving him hadiths and all kinds of things about the meritorious nature of prayer. And Muawiyah is like, "Wait a second, you're not the person who calls to good. You're the opposite. You're the bad guy. You're the one who's supposed to tell me to not pray. What are you doing here?" And he never accepts all of the arguments that Iblis and Rumi puts on the tongue of Iblis in the poem one of the most beautiful defenses of the Tawhid of Iblis, even though he doesn't accept it. He says, I was the first of the lovers. I used to walk with the God in paradise. He used to pat my head in springtime. And when I was a young student, I read this, I actually just wept because it was so beautiful. The language, the imagery, the way he frames him as this, total, just like a child being taken such good care of. Why would I've never forgotten about my first home. He's going, and Muawiyah is sitting there listening, and he says, no. There's something is up. Finally, by the end of the tale, he cracks under the pressure, so to speak, and he says, no, fine, I admit that I was up to no good. What I was trying to do was to get you to go to the masjid and pray, because I knew that if you missed the prayer in the masjid, you'd make a greater tawbah to God, you'd repent, and you'd become closer to God by having actually missed the prayer. So I was trying to get you to take the lesser of two goods in order so that I can keep my function of misguidance. And this is Rumi, it can be read as a kind of critique of the defense of the Tawhid of Iblis, is that you see him as a fallen lover, and these are the arguments for why it can be, but don't be fooled. This is a part of his trick. And so Rumi he'll maintain those dualities in keeping with the images that he's always drawing on in his poetry.
MashaAllah. Well, you've been generous with your time, and I know you have a limited amount of time. So in closing, because of course we could talk for much longer, but we want to read, and I know you're working on 2 research projects, so will you share what those are and then when they'll be released?
Yeah, sure. One of them, it's an Arabic edition and a translation of this book by Ayn al-Qudat that I mentioned, the one that he wrote when he was 24 in 3 days, called Zubdat al-Haqaiq, and it's the first Sufi exposition, the first philosophical exposition of Sufism. And it's an amazing book. It's an incredible book because he takes you to, through logical analysis, through all the stages of reasoning, but then he takes you to a stage that he calls it the stage beyond the intellect, following Ghazali. Tor ma wara al-aql, the stage beyond the intellect. And he says there are many stages. So that book, it's about the intellectual life and also the mystical life, and how the two can come together, but how there is the need to also become a lover and to taste God, not just with your mind, but with your entire being. So that book is supposed to come out in the Library of Arabic Literature series, and we're hoping that it comes out by 2021. These things have a life of their own. Sure. The other book, it's an anthology of Ayn al-Qudat's writings for State University of New York Press. That's it basically presents over 600 passages in his writings, thematically arranged and with facilitating commentary. And so we try to cover all of the main themes in his writings to show how they all kind of come together. So you'll get the passages in there about his moral theory, his understanding of human agency, and that'll be the ground for his exposition of Iblis. And you'll also learn, for example, in this book, that Ayn al-Qudat was also the first author to, again, theoretically speak about imagination, the world of imagination, in a very explicit way, tamassul, using the Quranic reference. And so the book tries to, just draw attention to the fact that this is such an important thinker in the tradition, and his unique language, the major themes that he takes, and many of the firsts that I think should be imputed to him are there, and then also how he, tried to explain the nature of beauty. He has a lot to say about contemplating God in forms, and he says at the highest level, the beauty that we're after can never match God's self-contemplation. Again, taking it to God's perspective. So the book ends with Ayn al-Qudat's meditations on beauty, and it begins with even his own autobiographical statements and his own spiritual experiences and his own encountering of the Prophet. And I should end as he does, his famous book Tamhidat, with the account that he gives of the Prophet and his meeting with the Prophet. So Tamhidat is Ayn al-Qudat's most famous book in Persian. It's over 300 pages, and it's just written from a very drunken state, and it's incredible. The late Leonard Lewison, he describes it as, just he has such a beautiful description of it. It's poetry, it's prose, it's got this drunken style, it's sober, it's rational, it's philosophical, it's poetic, all at once, and you really get this sense of just how he even wrote it. We're not even sure. It's really a remarkable book. But towards the end of the book, Ayn al-Qudat, he relates a dream that a friend of his has. He had lived a very intense visionary life, and he would have visions of the Prophet. His friends would have visions, and they'd share them, and they'd receive guidance from each other like this. And it was a very, very unusual set of circumstances that he'd be writing under. And the book ends like this. The Prophet communicates to Ayn al-Qudat through his friend. He says to him, let me see this book that you're holding, that you're writing. So Ayn al-Qudat's writing the Tamhidat. He gives him the book. This book, it's the first metaphysical book in the Persian language, I think. I think it's fair to say that. And the Prophet says, you're letting out too many secrets. Stop now. And then Ayn al-Qudat says that the minute the Prophet told me to stop letting out secrets and to cease writing this book, I stopped writing this book, and I'm waiting now for the next set of instructions. And that's literally how the book ends. He's a man who lived with the Prophet in the prophetic form, following his footsteps at every single moment, even to the point of being under the command of writing from him and ceasing to do so when he told him to do so.
So that collection of his works that you're working on, is that going to be published before or after
the goal? Originally, I was hoping that the Arabic edition would come out first, the Zubdat, and then this one, because you have the more sober, and then the more drunken one. But at this stage, every day I show up in the office and I kind of just have to let things take their natural toll. I had a whole plan of how things would work out, and clearly, it's not working out that way. In all likelihood, I think the Sunni Press book will come out first, but 2021, 2022, I'm hoping that the two of them will come out.
So is it kind of structured in the same way that Chittick's Sufi Path of Love or Sufi Path of Knowledge are, with many passages thematically introduced and contextualized?
This is exactly what I tried to do.
That's great. I love those books.
But I have to say, and I told this to Dr. Chittick one time when I began trying to do these chapters like that, that is a very difficult thing to do. He makes it look so easy, but it is really hard to piece it all together and develop a narrative around these passages and to contextualize them and to do it in such a way that you're there but you're kind of not there, and all you're really doing is just facilitating his words. But one of the things I really hope that comes out in the book is the beautiful nature of his prose, the way he talks, and his poetry, just the way his method of communication. He'll say things like you think you know the Quran, you don't know the Quran, and he'll tell you why you don't know the Quran. That's another thing. He's also the first author to develop a very unusual theory of the Quranic detached letters, which I've never seen in an author before him, and some after him who followed him, taken from him. He says that the Quran, in a number of its chapters, there are these mysterious detached letters. Yes, exactly. Ayn al-Qudat says, these are the detached letters that fell from the divine presence, and they got stuck. And then the rest of the words that fell down, they coagulated into words, and that's what we call the Quran. It's the detached letters in the Quran. He goes, but in their primal state, they're all detached letters, the whole Quran. And when you go beyond that, they come from little dots. And when you go on there, they ultimately devolve in nothingness. And so he has a kind of an anthropology and a cosmology of the Quran, of how it comes from the divine word and how it kind of fragments into the cosmic order. And again, there's only one heart that can receive that revelation, and that's the Prophet.
That's beautiful, and we should end there. There's one last question. Hopefully you can answer quickly.
Yes, of course.
Came up when you were talking. You mentioned that Ayn al-Qudat is a direct student of Ahmed Ghazali, the brother of Mohammed Ghazali. And many people don't know, especially those that are familiar with the Arabocentric kind of Islamic tradition, or that Ahmed Ghazali, by this mazhabi ishq, he's actually celebrated as the greater brother.
Yes, but by far.
He didn't get caught in the intellectual crisis.
Oh,
he
yeah,
went straight
that's
to
right.
the heart.
Yeah, from the very beginning.
And if I remember correctly, he also has similar. Ahmed Ghazali has similar statements about Iblis. Is that right?
Yes. He also he was in the tradition of the seeing Iblis as a fallen lover, and his own teachers also were in that tradition. Yeah, Ayn al-Qudat has a he had a few teachers, some very interesting people. He had this one Sheikh, Baraka Hamadani, who he met before he met Ahmed Ghazali, and this was an illiterate Sheikh. He literally couldn't read or write. He knew enough of the Quran to read the prayers. Ayn al-Qudat says, he goes, but he knew more Quran than I do, because his entire being was just effaced. Ahmed Ghazali was his formal teacher, and in an autobiographical statement, Ayn al-Qudat says that Ahmed Ghazali came to Hamadan, because he had a lodge probably in Hamadan where he used to instruct students. Ayn al-Qudat says, for 20 days I did khidmat to him, I served him. And then he says he just had this major opening. The eye of his basira opened, and then he was never the same after that. And of course, in the English language, we're very fortunate in that Joseph Lombard, our colleague and friend, he has a wonderful book on Ahmed Ghazali that was published in 2016, which is an excellent introduction to Ahmed Ghazali, the metaphysics of love, mazhab-e-ishq, all of these things.
All right, jazakallah khair.
Thank you.
Well, I know you haven't published yet, but you do have a few articles on Ayn al-Qudat that are published, right?
Yeah.
So we'll link to those so that people who are listening can...
Happy to share them. Thank you.